Hello and welcome to another special edition of PORA Raw PORA. This is a special edition. And I'm here with my co-host Caleb Jackson. What's up, Caleb? How's the missionary work going?
How's it going, David? I'm doing very well.
So how's the missionary work going? What's going on with that?
We actually just got done sharing, which is why we're doing this at this time. But it's been going great. It actually rained earlier today, so I was worried we wouldn't be able to get to do it. But it's going good over here, so I'm excited just to wrap the day up because it's been a busy week.
Right on, man. And how long does this is all summer, right?
Yep, till August.
Till August, right on, man. Well, we were supposed to have Travis here, but we don't know if he knew what time. Maybe he got, mixed up on the times. But the reason this is a special edition because this is the 4th of July, so we didn't really plan debates or anything like that. So we decided we were going to do 20-minute segments each, and in between we'd have an intermission period in between segments that would, get started for the next host to do their 20-minute segment. And I'm going to go first. And over a while, I've been on TikTok. So I have been listening to all sorts of people and a lot of different views. I've mainly dealt with the Hebrew roots movement. And what's funny is that some of these people that are really hardcore Torah observers have put their position out there, argued with the Christian, but when the atheist comes on, they don't say a word to them. And it's just odd to me. I don't know what it is about it. I don't know if they're just identifying with each other in a weird way. I don't know, but it's just, I don't know. It's crazy to me. Yeah. So, anyways, with that, I do deal with the atheists. I had a girl that goes by Mother of Dogs on or well, I didn't have her on, but I tried to get her to come on and she ignored me. So I'm going to just harp on some of her videos because I mean, some of the stuff she says is pretty good. So I want to give her a fair shake, but today my segment will be focusing on 1-minute videos with responses from me, Caleb, and if Travis jumps on, Travis. So that's what we'll get started with here today. But for further ado, Caleb, you got anything else in the intro that you want to talk about real quick? I know you're eating over there, so
I was trying to finish swallowing. No, I actually haven't seen this video, so I'm kind of going in blind, just like how last time. Oh, there's Daniel. How many bottles of snake oil did Caleb sell today? Yeah, I feel like Daniel's overall response is just always make fun of me somehow. So I don't know, Daniel. We'll find out by the end of this video, and it depends on how much snake oil I buy from this lady. So let's see what she's got to sell.
All right, let's go with video 1.
Every time I ask a Christian for an extra biblical account of the resurrection, I get some version of this argument. Prove your great-great-great-great-grandmother existed. And I know what you're trying to do, but it sets up a false dichotomy. First and foremost, my great-great-great-grandmother is not a historical figure. If she was, I would expect independent, disinterested accounts of her life. Second, nobody is claiming that my great-grandmother rose from the dead or performed miracles. Nobody is claiming that in order to go to heaven and save your soul from eternal damnation, you have to believe and pray and worship my great-great-grandmother. You are making extraordinary claims about a person in history. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And the problem is you don't even have very much basic evidence. So instead you counter with a what about. All you're doing is reaffirming that you don't have any actual evidence.
All right, that's number 1 there. So Caleb, what are your thoughts right away, my friend?
Oh boy, that's a lot. Okay. First of all, I'm a bit confused when she said her great-great-grandmother is not a historical figure because I thought by definition someone in history is a historical figure, but whatever. No, I think that, first of all, that's not even accurate, is what she's saying of there is no extra biblical citations for the resurrection. We actually do have enemy attestation. Now, not affirming it, but certainly mentioning that the Christians believed it. Obviously, Paul is the one, even though converted, but you could talk about Josephus. even though the passage does have interpolations and it's debatable as to how much he mentions it. Tacitus, which is less contentious, he calls it a superstition, but he mentions it starting in Jerusalem. So, and you could even point to someone like Quadratus, who was a early, I want to say a church, I don't know if he's a church father, but he was an early 2nd century figure who says that the people that Jesus healed and raised from the dead, some of them were actually still alive in his day, and that he implies that he may have known some of these people. So we have multiple sources outside the Bible that imply this, even if they don't agree with it. They at least mention that Christians were saying this and they believed it. And I think that only one other thing I'll hamper on is, I hear this motive of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but I don't really see a justification for that. I think it's just a catchphrase. But really, all you have to do to show that someone raised from the dead is to show that they were alive, which we do every single day with people. Anyone can tell if someone's alive, to see if they're dead, which again happens every single day because people die every day, and then just to see that they're alive again. The only thing extraordinary is the chronology, but it doesn't require extraordinary evidence in the sense of evidence that we wouldn't see. All you need is witnesses to the person being alive, witnesses to the person being dead, and then witnesses to the person being alive again. So she's really, I think, equivocating the word extraordinary there, and they really need to define what they mean when they use the term.
Right. Yeah. So, like, where I was going to start was the whole, there's several things that I saw here. And the first one was, there are bad apologists out there, are bad defenders out there. And to quickly just jump to the gun and say, well, prove your great grandmother existed. Yeah, that's kind of, I understand where that's going, but like, and I kind of understand her frustration, you know, but you're right on the aspect of, well, yeah, she did exist in history, and that's true. And if she left any memoirs around, then we would expect to at least find that somewhere. Where she goes off on the tantrum of worshiping and God sending you to hell. I don't really understand why this is such a big sticking point for them. If God is giving you freedom to either be with him or not, then where's the objection there? Do you even know what I'm talking about on that?
You're saying as far as like
Yeah,
hell,
why
as
is it
far
an
as
actual objection? Why does his claims even matter? I mean, why does the claims that she's like complaining about, why is that part of her objection? That's what I'm trying to get at.
oh, well, the
The
way I
whole idea of God sending you to hell and all this stuff, and it just okay. So what? That has nothing to do with the actual evidence. You know what I mean?
yeah, the way I think she was saying it, and I kind of talk about this in the upcoming book I'm doing, is that I think that the way it is that, yes, using normal history, we can maybe say something happened, but the fact that God is omnipotent and could give us any kind of evidence he wanted to, and the fact that the evidence we have is at least questionable. I'm saying what they would say, and the fact that your entire life is dependent on it, your entire eternal soul, we would expect it to be more convicting, right? They would say, you can deny that Julius Caesar existed, and who cares, because that's not going to affect your life. But if you deny Jesus rose from the dead, well, you're going to go to hell forever. And so, if God wants to convince you Jesus rose from the dead, he better give some dang good evidence to convince you of that. And they would say that it's not up to the par that God could do. So that's how I understand that objection.
Yeah, I guess, but I don't know. But yeah, then she goes into the aspect of extraordinary claims requires extraordinary evidence, and then she makes the audacious claim about we don't have much evidence. And this is what blows my mind. I mean, even Ehrman, who I think she's a fan of, says there's like 11 external sources other than the Bible that talk about Jesus Christ and stuff like that. And many of those attestations when it comes to the resurrection are don't go against it. He was crucified. His followers did say he rose again. So we've got a ton of different evidences to pull from. So like you said, there's the enemy attestation. Then you have kind of like that neutral attestation that goes along with it as well. I would consider I know some people consider Josephus an enemy at a station, but I would consider him more of a neutral because I don't think he really had a skin in the game. He was just
I
reporting.
agree.
I think
Right.
his
Right.
yeah, I think his stuff was more just historical anyway, where you can definitely clearly see a bias with Tacitus and Pliny, you know. So as far as us not having evidence, I don't know why people even say that. I mean, you have this obscure carpenter preacher in Galilee that gets more notification than like anybody in that time period. You know what I mean? So it's crazy to me. But
Besides emperors and like important political figures, how many people do you know in that time period would have 4 biographies written about them? It's nothing.
exactly.
How many other teachers do you have other than like Pythagoras and some of the philosopher teachers? But even
Right.
then, you don't have the same. I don't think you have nearly as many. So yes, because people were just going around writing biographies about carpenters and
Right.
rabbis, which if they were lucky, they may get mentioned by Josephus and then maybe mention the Mishnah 200 years later. So it's like
All
it's
right.
not as if, and most people back then were illiterate, so it's not like they're gonna be writing this down instantly. It's just
Yeah.
not how
And
that
what
works.
about like Talmudic claims? I mean,
Mm.
the the uh the Jews said they killed him or they got him killed. He died for sorcery. They didn't
Mhm.
say just like simple tricks. Sorcery is a big deal. You know, that means they believed that he was actually doing some sort of magic of some sort of real demonic stuff, you know. So I mean, you have that. And then extraordinary claims again. I'd like to flesh that out just a little bit before we move on to the next one. But extraordinary claims, require extraordinary evidence. Uh, yeah, like you, I don't see why that's such a big deal. Like you said, it just says 3 simple things. He died, and the people believed he rose again. And what was the other one that they found an empty tomb? What was the other one you used?
I just said that he was alive, he died, and then he was alive again. It's all you
Yeah,
need.
yeah, yeah. Alive,
Which,
died, then yeah,
in
yeah.
which,
And
by the
so
way, we have ways of like even today that we have plenty of. I wouldn't say plenty. We have a good number of cases where we've done just that, or we can confirm the person was dead, sometimes for a day or more, and
yeah,
then they were alive, and this was on video in front of many witnesses, and doctors were there and stuff like that. So it's not like
yeah,
it. You have, it's not as if this is something that just happens then and never happened again. I think you can't ignore the other context around stuff like miracles, and unless you're just going to take David Hume's approach and just dismiss all of it. But
yeah. What was one of those what was one of the counters to David Hume at that time?
uh,
Do you know off
William
the top of your head?
Paley. William Paley countered Hume, a couple other contemporaries whose names I can't remember off the top of my head, but they essentially, I mean, Hume's my favorite critique of Hume was in 2000 by an atheist or an agnostic philosopher called John Ehrman, who wrote a whole book
Yeah, yeah,
called
I read that. Yeah,
Hume's Abject Failure, and he was basically
yeah,
saying like, I'm not even a Christian, but this is just an awful argument because
yeah. And they countered a lot of his stuff, but
yeah.
uh, man, he had contemporaries writing
Mhm.
at that time too that countered him. But I don't know why they never got the recognition. But the whole idea of like, okay, so if there again, why does extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? I think this is how I deal with it. If I deal with any claim, I'm going to do an investigation regardless. You know, what makes more sense of the data, and that's what I'll go with, regardless of I'm not going to put a label just to basically try to be able to deny a claim. I don't want to throw so much bias against it before I even jump into the investigation.
Which
But
is
yeah,
funny because David Hume didn't even go that far. David Hume said we don't even need to investigate because we know this is false. And so, like literally at one point, he's he's criticizing the Bible. And he says, "Look at Blaise Pascal's niece. She had this eyesore, but she was instantly healed. All these medical doctors came around, confirmed it. We have better evidence for this than we do for the resurrection, and we know this didn't happen. So why should we believe the resurrection?" And he just moves on from that, and it's like that seems a bit of a circular reasoning. He does the same thing with a case where an amputee was healed, and he says, it wasn't necessary to have to investigate this. I can dismiss this based on any testimony because I know this can't happen. And so we don't even need to show this is a fraud. I can just say it is because I know that it can't happen. So it's very circular and begs the question. And it's pretty embarrassing. And sorry, I just read what Daniel put down here.
Yeah. Any claim that goes
true.
against my worldview that I'll arbitrarily deny that there is sufficient evidence for.
Right.
That was a good one, man. But yes, so let's go to number 2 because I don't want to spend too much time on each of these.
Revelation Part 1. I'm going to start with some background information so that you can better understand the book once we get into it. Revelation is part of a genre called apocalyptic literature. This is primarily found in the 400-year period between the Maccabean Revolt in 167 CE and the Second Christian century. Apocalyptic literature is primarily written during times of crisis or persecution. D.S. Russell calls it the literature of the oppressed who see no hope for themselves politically or in the plane of human existence. This genre is exceptionally heavy in symbolism and also in esoteric language. This genre also has an underlying sense of dualism which stems primarily from Zoroastrianism. It looks at time and history in 2 categories, the present evil age and the glorious age to come, or God's kingdom on earth. This break between the old and the new is usually referred to as an end and involves a cosmic battle between good and evil. The prototype for this genre is the Book of Daniel, and the author of Revelation leans heavily on the symbolism of that book, which Christians and Jews in the first century would have been very familiar with.
All right. Off the top of your head, Caleb.
So what?
Yeah, right. Okay, so what I really wanted to hit on here was the idea of borrowing, right? Because you see that in there she said that dualism was taken from Zoroastrianism. The Jews' idea of dualism was taken from Zoroastrianism. Well, this I've never understood why modern scholarship is so keen on this idea of borrowing that had to be the case, that these guys borrowed from this guy borrowed from that, and all these guys just borrowed from each other. I never understood that. Yes, there's certain parallels that exist within all religions. There are certain things that do, like usually most deities are miracle workers, right? Like most of those figures are miracle workers. They do miracles, they perform miracles, some of them are immortal, but some of them aren't. But like there are some parallels that actually run alongside each other. But historically, I don't understand this claim either, because Zoroastrianism came about already after Moses and Abraham and some of the prophets. So like I think Zoroaster was like during the 6th or 7th century, right? So we already had Mosaic law at that point. Judaism was already practicing. So if anything, I think it would be Judaism that influenced Zoroastrianism in the least, so at least that's what I and correlation always doesn't mean causation either. So I just like to throw that caveat in there too. So.
Well, I think what they would say is that they typically date, or I mean, depending on how you do the documentary hypothesis, they would say most of the Pentateuch was written during or shortly before or shortly after the Babylonian exile. So they would say all of the Mosaic traditions, or at least most of them, were post-Babylon and therefore had that influence. But
that still doesn't make sense historically, because we know that David lived and they were already practicing Judaism and the Mosaic law when David lived. So, I mean, it doesn't match up historically.
Yeah, I don't know the exact data points as far. I mean, we have I want to say it's a $10 steal. I forget what it's called about David, but I think other than that, we don't know much about, as far as archaeologically, we don't have.
Well, I mean, we found the city of David and so forth.
Right. But I guess to say like what religious
practice coins from that time, and there's a lot of stuff you can actually see. As far as himself, that would be. I don't know. I don't know the exact dates on the psaltery, or not.
I think it just meant more like religious, what they were practicing at the time, as far as religious practices. Like, did they have their theology developed? Was it still evolving? But to me, none of that really matters, just because
they had the Ark of the Covenant. I mean, they had all those things. I mean, right. I don't see Solomon and according to
David, texts. But again,
and I mean, what about kings? And I mean, I don't get it. All I know is that we did have prophets at that time, and there obviously was. I mean, the old covenant already existed, so there's no way that, I mean, Judaism already existed, even if it was in its in a different, with the laws existed. I don't see any way around that. It had to exist before then. Maybe not in the way it did after the 6th century or the exile, but it had to have existed. Isaiah. I mean, we know Isaiah existed before the fall and everything.
right.
So I mean, it's just I don't think that that's a very good argument. In other words, I think it would be more likely that Judaism influenced Zoroastrianism, as far as I'm concerned. I think there's more evidence swinging that way, but
I'm not going to comment on who influenced who because I don't really care. I don't think I know enough about Assyriology to make that judgment. But I am at least glad. I think it's at least better than the really old arguments that Jesus is just a copycat of dying and rising gods like Osiris and Mithras and Zalmoxis and all these other ones.
it's those type of scholars that are also doing this, with Zoroastrianism and so forth.
And
Which,
with Judy, I mean, Christianity also. Granted, the Jews did embrace certain things, but that was like a different. If you're talking about like the time that Jesus lived in the Maccabean area, they were very much against Gentile influence. And so, I mean, even Paul talks about even Peter wouldn't even want to eat with Gentiles. So I just don't see this being reasonable at all of these Jews saying, hey, these Gentiles have some really cool ideas about these dying and rising gods. We should copy them. Like they didn't even want to be in the same house as Gentiles because they thought they'd be unclean. So the idea that they would just intentionally borrow from this at that time period, at least, I'm not saying they didn't do it earlier, but not within antiquity of the, I think, 2nd century BC to 2nd century AD or whatever it is. So but as far as Revelation goes, yes, it is a genre of apocalypticism. There are tropes in there, but again, who cares? I mean, Jesus, most scholars today think that the Gospels are Greco-Roman biography, and so it follows similar tropes, but that's what a genre is. That's the whole reason why we have genres, is because there's similar tropes in it. So the fact that they're using imagery doesn't mean that it's intentionally copied. In fact, I really like how Dale Allison says this, because Dale Allison's really big on comparing Jesus to Moses, that he's the new Moses. But even when he was asked, he didn't say that he thought these were fabricated to mimic Moses. He's like, no, if you look in history, all the time there are people who intentionally try to follow other people. Like you can give Alexander the Great tried to copy Achilles, and Julius Caesar tried to copy Alexander the Great, and Napoleon tried to copy Julius Caesar, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't mean that we doubt that any of the events they did actually happen. They just were intentionally basing their lives off of these people. So that doesn't mean anything as far as the historicity of it. I mean, you might as well try to draw all the parallels between Kennedy and Lincoln people do and say that, aha, one of these is fictional. So seems different in foreign cultures. Documents. Yeah, thank you. Physical. We don't have any physical evidence for any of the documents.
Everything I read on the Zoroastrianism too is that there's no clear evidence either way. And with a lot of these conclusions some of these modern scholars make, it blows my mind that there's some of this stuff that you can see that just comes out of thin air. Like, I don't understand, and maybe it's not the modern scholars. Let's take it back a step, because we do have a problem with internet atheists too. Something like some of the claims that they make for Horus, like
Horus is not even,
like being born of a virgin. Like, are you kidding me? Are you totally ignoring the account where ISIS commits necrophilia, or erects a obelisk and sits on it? I mean, are you totally going to? So I guess we just ignore those and go with the ones that post-date Christianity, You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
any writers
And
that post-date Christianity, go with that. And not only
Horace
that, but then you get stuff like Krishna and stuff, and then you come to find out that there's Hindu scholars that say that actually Christianity did influence Hinduism at a certain point in time. So like they could trace where it came in. So it's pretty wild.
Yeah, most of them do post date it. And as far as like Horace goes, even like at least credentialed mythicists, like Richard Carey and Robert Price, won't even use that because the whole Horace thing came from some self-taught Egyptologist in like the 1800s named Gerald Massey, who didn't provide any evidence for anything he said. He just made these claims like, yes, Horace was born of a virgin, had 12 disciples, was crucified, even though crucifixion wasn't a thing back in the Egyptian times, but and then was raised from the dead on the third day. And the thing is, when you actually look at these claims online, like these memes, they don't give any citations. They just say it and expect you to believe it. They don't give you, here, go in the original Egyptian text and show me where it says this. But no one ever does because it's not in there. So they're literally just making this up.
So I actually responded to somebody about the holidays because we got into the holiday stuff again. And I was like, show, this is bunk. There's no, can you show me any of these gods that have a birthday on December 25th? Right. So what did I get? I got a Wikipedia article, and she responded to me in video too. And I said, oh my gosh, I said, where are your primary sources? Give me some primary sources,
But
that
Jesus
say
wasn't
this.
even
And they don't.
associated. The 25th wasn't even associated until like the 4th century. The Bible never
Right.
says.
Well, I was, like I said, I was arguing the holiday, that the 25th is actually a pagan holiday and this and that, but there are no deities that are actually born on the 25th. There are no original primary source documents that say that they're born on the 25th. None. Zero. So even like Sol Invictus, which is the closest one, right? That they say, and Saturnilla, right? Those are the two closest ones. Saturnilla started on the around the 17th and ended on the 20th. Sometimes it would go the 23rd if the people were really wanting to party, right? Never on the 25th. Sol Invictus was either celebrated earlier in December or sometimes in the fall and sometimes in the summer in August. So there's just no evidence here. We have like stuff like the Philocalian calendar. We have other people talking about why they set it to December 25th. We have ancient sources that tell us that we can trace our history back because they kept such meticulous records. So, anyways, out of the first century, Christianity has the best evidence as far as I'm concerned, as far as what I've studied over the years. I mean, we have what the whole Bible can be basically reconstructed from the early church fathers. We've got only 40 lines unresolved by textual criticism out of all the manuscripts we have. We have uniformity across continents. We have early manuscripts. I mean, we just have an abundance of riches, or embarrassment of riches, like Dan Wallace says, and that's just true. We can even trace our early creeds and so forth. I mean, there's just a lot. So, anyways, on to the next, I guess. Anything else you want to say on that one?
No, I can move on.
All right. Now this is gonna bombard you a little bit.
Here's an unpopular but widely held take. The anonymous men that wrote the Gospels had access to the Messianic scriptures. They then wrote their narratives in order to fit the scriptures. And the fact that Christians have not done enough research to understand this, and yet they continuously blame the Jews for not recognizing foreshadowing, for killing their Savior, and for refusing to acknowledge him as Savior, is absolutely anti-Semitic. The early church fathers were also anti-Semitic. They introduced a theological stance called Jewish deicide, in which they blamed the Jews for killing their own Savior. And if y'all don't see that still occurring today, then I don't know what to tell you. It's anti-Semitism.
All right, man. So the first thing I wanted to harp on here was the anonymity of the text. E.P. Sanders is one of the great ones about this. He said that, they, anonymous texts were more authoritative. people believe that anonymous texts were more authoritative. It were like an encyclopedia article. So I mean, this is people on her side of the fence, that aren't believers, that are secular scholars, and they're saying that, hey, most Greco-Roman biographies were anonymous, at that time, and that's just the way it is. It was helps to be more authoritative, but the issue is that we do have a rich and early tradition that names the authors of the Gospels, people that would have known them, So, what were your thoughts on that barrage of stuff there?
So yeah, I haven't read enough Sanders to know whether or not they're more authoritative. I'll take your word at that. I've heard that so many people argue that they're doing the anonymity to mimic the Old Testament. That might be true. I'm not entirely sure, but you are correct that in the technical sense they're anonymous because the names aren't on the actual documents or stated in the documents. But we do have, I mean, Tacitus's annals never say it was written. I Tacitus, but it was attributed to him a couple hundred years later. So
No, it was actually a tribute to him way later.
okay, well, I was being generous. I think it was.
You're being very generous. I
Yeah.
I got the notes here somewhere.
So yeah, I don't know if I don't know if it's most, but certainly a good portion of them were anonymous. As far as the actual authors, I don't really take a position, and I know Daniel is watching, and he's gotta get my cash for that. I don't really take a position as to who wrote the gospel because there's a lot of arguments on both sides, and most of that I think comes down to internal evidence. Because external, you have the church fathers, but then they say certain things and that sometimes don't seem to be accurate, and you have to just balance that all out. Zephanon narrates it. Yeah, there you go, Zephanon. So I don't really take a position as far as who wrote them, and I don't think it really matters because for me it's criteriological, saying, well, okay, we don't know what their sources were, we don't know who wrote them, so it could be put on edge, but at the same time we can confirm certain things externally. We can look at different ways, what seems to be likely, is it embarrassing, is it multiply attested, and stuff like that. So there's criteria, and scholars have known this for hundreds of years, since the German criticism, like the 1700s. We've known that, and we have ways of figuring out what's historical and what's not. So we don't just sit there and say, well, we don't know, so let's just throw the whole source out. Like, it's just not how you do biblical exegesis or scholarship. As to the second point about deicide, I actually will say that, yes, I think Christians, I don't know how far back it goes in church history, but certainly Christians did treat Jewish people badly. I don't think that's how Jesus treated Jewish people, and I think that we're called to be more like, Christ. Certainly Martin Luther, which is way later, was very anti-Semitic, as was Calvin, and one could argue that Lutheranism is kind of what partially at least gave rise to Nazism and blame on the Jews there. So I'm not going to say that Christianity has always been great to the Jews, but then again, there's been back and forths on both sides. You can read Justin Martyr's work, Dialogue with Trypho, when he's arguing with a Jew about the resurrection. You could read, as you were saying earlier, the Babylonian Talmud, or there's another text called The Toldet Yeshua, which is like a Jewish kind of fan fiction making fun of the Christian story, where Jesus is a failed magician and his body is still in the tomb, and they go and drag it out and parade it, showing how stupid the disciples are and all that stuff. So certainly there were nasty people on both sides, and obviously there was a lot of Jewish persecution in the first century towards the Christians. Paul, plenty of other people, and if you read the Book of Acts. So it's not as if I'm not saying we should retaliate and get revenge, but it is something that was on both sides, and I would condemn any anti-Semitism today, and I think that our Jewish brothers should also be saved, and plenty of Jewish people have converted to Christianity as a result. I mean, Jesus himself was Jewish; he wasn't technically a Christian, so yeah, we should view Jesus from a Jewish perspective.
Right. So, one thing I would push back a little bit on that is the whole idea of Martin Luther, right? So I don't think Luther was very anti-Semitic early on. I know he was later in life, after he had dealt with gout and his whole controversy of the Jews in Germany and stuff like that. So one time I was, when I was doing some study on this, is that Luther had made a deal with a Jewish sect or whoever was trying to cross and migrate into Germany at the time. He made a deal with them that if the king would allow them to migrate, that they would contribute to the society and convert. Well, when they got there, they didn't neither. So supposedly that like put a very bad taste in Luther's mouth. And that's what I think led to him going overboard in his pain and suffering as he got older and sicker. Because a lot of that stuff you can look back and you can see him. Those writings were way later in his life. So, and yeah, I also agree that anti-Semitism, Daniel Lowry said this too, did exist in Germany long before Luther as well. Yeah. So, but that's just one of the things I read a while ago. Well, actually, a long time ago now. I'm old, but anyways, man, that's pretty much everything that I had to say on that, man. Anything else for you, Caleb?
No, not on that.
Right, man. We're gonna take a quick break, and yeah. All right, Caleb, you're in charge.
Great. Yeah, so because this was last minute, I didn't have time to pull together a video or anything like that. But considering that we're so close to July 4th, it's July 3rd, but we can cheat a little bit. I did kind of want to speculate on the idea of like Christian nationalism and where does patriotism come in terms of faith. Should we hold to something like nationalism, or should we be open and stuff like that? So I think that's just an intriguing question, and it seems to me that more recently, especially in the past, let's say, decade, it's been more and more common for people to vote alongside and consider, that America is this haven and God's chosen nation, essentially, which is its own thing, and that I don't want to give names, but that certain presidents, perhaps the prior president, was ordained by God to restore, just Christian justice and all that stuff. So, I for example, I'm hesitant, and I used to be that side, but I would like to think that Christianity does not really entail nationalism, and although nationalism is not a sin, certainly faith should come before country. And when people try to compromise Christian values for the sake of nationalistic tendencies, I think that's wrong, and that should not be approved of by the church. And so ultimately the church is a global thing, and we are supposed to be united as Christ under any country, and not ordained to it. So those are just some of my opening thoughts, and I didn't know if you had anything to say regarding any of that.
Well, yeah, we're part of another nation, part of another nationality. And we're kind of like little nations within a big nation, within another nation, but yeah, I don't see a problem with people being patriotic. Um, I do believe that the system of government we have is worth uh taking pride in at times. It definitely did have it's an experiment, with freedom and everything. To me, the republic that is set up, that guaranteed rights, and that the people were the ones that were in charge of it, and I think that was the right move. And I think that some of the early reflections of our founders tried to put together a government that kind of reflected a better way, that kind of reflected heavenly things, you know, um, like the idea of the judicial being, the law, the legislature being the lawgiver, um, and the presidency being kind of in I can't even remember, but Larry Arnn talks about it from Hillsdale, and he takes that route, and goes into the history and looks at it from that that perspective. And then you've got to also deal with the fact that our founding fathers and the people that signed the Constitution, all in their memoirs, if you look in their memoirs, they did cite this as they did use a lot of religious connotations to how it's formed and how the government works. Such as Adam saying, this country can't run unless people that know the Bible and that are moral, and uh, are in office. So there's a lot there, and I think that they tried to. Uh, I don't want to say they tried to make a quote unquote Christian nation, but one that definitely reflected the values that they believed would bring the greatest freedom.
Yeah, well, I'd be a little bit careful there because I know some people like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine were not Christians by any sense. They were more deists.
Well, I
Um,
mean, he did belong to the Episcopals, Thomas Jefferson did. So
right,
he did write the letter to the Danbury Baptist to ensuring religious liberty.
mm,
So I would also be cautionate by saying he's we're totally was totally wrong, but yes, he did believe in the moral teachings and stuff like that.
right,
So as far as his idea of natural theology, he did believe uh, deistically, maybe, but his deism, he was heavily influenced by biblical teachings.
right. Well, he did
So
rewrite that. He made a copy of the New Testament, but he took out all the miracles. He's like, I like the
yeah,
teachings of Jesus, but I don't want to have to deal with all this. But yeah, no, I think that's for me, it doesn't really. I don't think the founding is as important, just because I don't think that you have to be what you were founded as, even though that's a good starting point. But that gets in for me into deeper questions, like in Romans 13, it says, "Be subject to governing authorities." And so when you look at the founding of this country as a revolution, as a standing up to authority. Um, where should we stand on that? Should we be saying, no, we have to submit to authorities because authorities are appointed by God? Or do we say, well, this is injustice and we should step up and do what's right, even if it
well,
means
yeah,
breaking the law?
yeah. Well, it depends on what you mean by authority, right? So if you look at our founders, the citizens obeyed their state legislatures, their colonial legislatures, over the monarchical legislature that was coming from Britain. So I don't think you could blame any person that fought the Revolutionary War as doing something sinful when they were doing just what they're supposed to be doing. They picked who they were going to submit to, and they submitted to that authority. So also, I I hate to say it, but people have a right to defend themselves. We didn't go over to Britain; they came to us. They
Right.
invaded. They sent the invasion force to subdue the colonies, and those people defended themselves. So there's that as well. So do I think that there is a time where uh, another legislature can throw off another legislature? Yes, I do, and I think that should be done with the utmost care, the utmost sincerity, and the utmost. Yeah, they have to go through everything. So I think that that's a very fine line, but I think that the state legislatures or the colonial legislatures, I keep saying state, there weren't states yet, but the colonial legislatures did what they thought was best in the interest of the people that were there.
So how do you distinguish between when it's okay to resist governing authorities and when it's okay to submit? Under what
Easily.
circumstances?
If you're looking at the founding and the Revolutionary War, I think the state legislature, you're looking at you're looking at two governments at that point, you know, go at odds. So I wouldn't say that okay, uh, for the people, I would say that they were right to go after their state or obey their colonial legislature. The colonial legislature, they I don't think that I think they were a legislature in themselves, and that's where they're like, okay, we are the legislature, we're going to go against this legislature, and that's where the war started. They declared their independence. But as far as Christians go, whenever a government uh is trying to stop us from uh presenting the gospel and stuff like that is where I would probably draw the line. If they try to stop me from doing anything that is gospel related, I would stop that. Yeah, I would. I wouldn't stop that. I wouldn't submit to that.
I would agree. I mean,
I
that's
would
what
be
happened.
submissive to the government, but I would not submit to the. You know what I mean? I would
Yeah.
be. I would be utterly peaceful in that demonstration, and that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and certainly there. I mean, that's what happened to early Christians. You know, under Nero, they got executed when the Roman government went after them. Uh, so I think that's fair. And I guess another sense of this like nationalism is like you'll see painting. I forget what the painting's called, where it's like Jesus holding up the United States Constitution as if it's like inerrantly inspired. And I think that's just a bit of a dangerous route to go down, right? Not that I absolutely respect the Constitution. I think the people who wrote it were brilliant, not perfect by any standards. Certainly, things like the 3/5 compromise, I think we could have done without. But
Well, I mean, you also got to look at Hamilton's idea of that too. There's another side of history that no one ever considers with the 3/5 law, and it was Hamilton actually brought up the 3/5 law because he knew that if the South were to get the votes of their slaves, they would be able to keep slavery together forever. So, like,
right,
that's why he proposed the 3/5 laws. Hamilton was actually an abolitionist, so he was
right. No,
heavily influenced by the abolition. Yeah.
yeah, certainly, and that's where it was like, you had to negotiate because if you just banned it outright, there would have been issues. So I understand it's a very careful. In
Yeah,
hindsight, it's much easier to criticize it.
yeah. On the outside, it is because I know what they were thinking. They were thinking, well, we couldn't have formed this union if we didn't make compromises, and the South would have never joined a union if they weren't able to carry over their slaves.
Right.
You know,
Unfortunately.
fortunate, yeah. And I think what really set us back as we continued was the Dred Scott decision. You know,
Mhm.
so that was horrendous. But
Yeah.
yeah, we definitely have a lot of ghosts in our closets and skeletons in our closets. But as far as like the idea of America, I think was amazing. You know, so when it comes to that citizenship, God does know that we are citizenships of a country and we're citizens of heaven. You know, so we have things that we have to do here as we have to render to Caesar's what is Caesar's, and we have to render to God what is God's. You know, so
Yeah.
there's that aspect.
It is, and I think just American Christianity in general has been a very weird situation because you have a lot, especially the most popular. You know, you have a lot of televangelists, a lot of mega churches, and a lot of prosperity gospel. I think it's not exclusively American, but certainly it's a major aspect of contemporary evangelicalism in many circles, at least. So, yeah, that I think is something that's unfortunate, and it's a very it's a very first world way of looking at the gospel, and really, if you go to other countries, Christianity is very different and um, very much more humble, let's say, and I think it's a good thing. But
Yeah. Well, also though, I was me and some friends were talking about this kind of stuff, and we were talking about what should we do in these certain government situations where they're trying to take our rights? Do we take part in another civil war? And I'm like, no, you know, you have to. In other words, and I was this way at one time too, where I would jump on that bandwagon because I integrated faith with politics for a number of years in my youth, you know. Yeah, youth. It's a thing of the past now, but
20 years ago,
right, yeah. Um, Not quite 20 years ago. I wasn't political 20 years ago, but soon after. But my conservatism, I took uh that nationalistic conservatism that was uh, more heavily Christian conservatism than it was conservatism and constitutional conservatism, where you separate the two. And even over the years, I've separated it more and more and more because I'm seeing that as even conservatism doesn't live up to the expectations of what I think the gospel is teaching, I have to continually side more with the gospel. And I told my friends, I said, guys, don't be so quick to run into a conflict with anything unless you've weighed it with the utmost importance. You've weighed it. Yeah, just you have to weigh that. You have to count that cost. And are you violating the scriptures now? Are you violating what God would want you to do? Would you be harming somebody unjustly at this point? Um, so I mean, some people say, well, if they outlawed the Second Amendment, would you fight? And I'm like, no. you know, I strongly love my guns and my rights to carry, but I won't participate in a war over it because I don't think that's what God would want. You know. So, anyways, that's kind of me.
Yeah. I'm kind of a pacifist anyway, and although I absolutely support the Second Amendment, and I really hope they don't ever get rid of it, but I personally am not necessarily the biggest fan of using violence to get a point across. Um, Even though that can be effective, sometimes I think generally it's not, and that's more why I'm a libertarian, because I believe in freedom, and I believe that although the government is here and placed by God, I don't necessarily believe in theocracy. I think God gives us free will to decide whether or not we want to follow Him, and that should turn over as well in our governmental system, where people have the freedom to sin if they want. Um, Now, it's not total anarchy. Obviously, you have to have some kind of standards and social orders. But and I want to say it's First Corinthians. I'm pretty sure it is First Corinthians, where Paul says, why are you judging those who are outside the church? Are you not to judge those who are inside the church? And it kind of surprised me when people get upset that non-Christians don't act like Christians. Like, yeah, what did you expect? So why should we expect non-Christians to follow certain conservative Christian ethics? It's just not. People have their own lives, and I wouldn't expect someone to understand my position without first hearing the arguments. Because yeah, it's a lot of it's tough to swallow, and certainly if you're just gonna have a hedonistic approach of, well, if it feels good, do it, then that's a better justification. But I think for Christians, we're called to a higher standard. But I also recognize that not everybody accepts that standard, and that's fine. They have the freedom to reject that if they may. So
Right.
yeah, so
Right. Yeah.
that's why, so that's why I would be. Uh, that's why I think legality and morality are not always. They can be intertwined, but they don't always need to be. So when it comes to things that Christianity would be normally against, like homosexual marriage or prostitution or drug use or laws pertaining to pornography and so forth. I don't think the government is necessarily supposed to get involved in those, even though I would prefer people don't do those. As a Christian, I don't think it's the government's place to force you to say, no, you can't do this, because that's just a nurturing government at that point. That's just seeing it like it's a parent almost.
Yeah. So you would say, and I would think this would tell me if I'm right. You would say the government shouldn't be involved in things like marriage at all, right?
Yes, unless it's as long as between consenting adults, because there is a standard of like the non-aggression principle, which is where you have to have consent on both sides for any action. And since minors cannot give consent, that is a bit different. So, with issues pertaining to children, the government can be more involved because they simply don't have the ability to give consent. So it's not as if the government just would turn a blind eye to an 11-year-old getting married or something like that.
Yeah, but
But
don't you see that that it's people that are putting these laws and these regulations in place in the first place, right? So if not what we have now, with government being involved, it would be somebody else's idea of maybe government not being involved, or a government being only involved to an extent and stuff like that. So it's a very, very fine line. It's a weird line because if you think about it, who are you to say that the consenting adult thing is the right way? You know what I mean? Maybe it should be like communism and be authoritarian, So I mean, what I think we have to have a foundation, right? So if we don't legislate that foundation, because everything is, people say you can't legislate morality, but that's the only thing you can legislate,
mhm.
because it all comes down to what you think is right and wrong, right?
Yeah, well, so under libertarianism there are criteria like the NAP, that's it, the non-aggression principle, which is saying that the government should not get involved unless you're using force against someone or breaking their consent. So two people exchanging any kind of service relationship, as long as they're agreeing to it, and that's based on the ideas of like bodily autonomy, that you have the right to your own life and property, and so forth. So those are the minimum standards. It does say this is the standard we're going to enforce. So anything beyond that that doesn't directly violate someone else's freedom, you can do. And so
Oh,
that's why they would draw the line on some and not others. It's not just
yeah.
arbitrary.
So yeah, well, and that's the thing though, is like, you look at marriage, and if that contributes to the overall good of your society, and the government is invested into the next generation, where's that's where I think that they could get. That's where we get into that gray area, right? To where we're saying, okay, how far do they get involved,
Mm,
right? What type of relationships should the government promote in that aspect? Is it a relationship that helps progress the society and keep the society going? And that's kind of like where I am in favor of natural marriage. But I also see your point in the government not being able to be involved in marriage at all. So it's not, and I'm not saying I'm taking a stance on either or, right? Because I think I'm more like, yeah, the government should stay out of everything, because everything they touch they ruin, right? They mess up. But yeah,
isn't the
man,
law?
it's that necessary evil that is talked about by our founders, but yeah.
But I think like that's a double-edged sword, because you could pull it the other way and say, how far can the government regulate it? Because if you're going to go and say you believe in natural marriage, you could also, why not go further and make divorce illegal, which is other than abuse and cheating, which is what Jesus taught. You could go ahead and make premarital sex illegal, because that
Right.
is not consistent with that. So why?
Well,
How
there, it
far?
used
How
to
far do
be,
you want
right?
to go?
Yeah, and it used to be, right? I mean, there were some of these laws in place back in the day, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
and that's we look at it now, we're like, oh man, but that's maybe, is it because maybe we're too comfortable? Maybe we don't know the value of marriage, and what it takes to uh to struggle in a struggling atmosphere, and how the family could basically alleviate that, and how breaking up a family could harm society and stuff like that. So I think, of course, there's progression, obviously, and stuff like that. So I mean, it's just hard to pinpoint uh, what's good about that and what's not.
Yeah, and I
So,
think I think we're talking about like what's good for society. That's kind of a very like utilitarian way of viewing it.
but that's
Whereas,
also where the government comes in, right?
well, yeah, I don't know. I would say that so there's positive and negative freedom. So positive freedom is typically freedom that like helps societies develop. Negative freedom is more autonomous and individualistic. So I would lean towards saying the government is meant to protect individual rights, but I don't think the government should have any invested interest in the collective happiness of its populace per se, as
Yeah,
long
but
as it's so. Even if half of your population of their own free will decides to get high and not work, and productivity decreases, I'm not entirely sure that's the government's job to get involved and do something other than maybe they can promote it. But I think people will have to be responsible for their own actions and see their own consequences. But I don't necessarily. I think simply stating that the government is supposed to get involved in the collective good is just begging the question that a lot of people just don't second guess at all.
yeah, but here's the thing, though, is also the government is supposed to take care of the general welfare of the people, right? So I mean, it's supposed to jump into that general welfare area, and
It
that's
depends on how
where.
you're defining general welfare, though, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I can see, and this is why I even think Locke uh uh promoted even some of these social ideas into his stuff, was because, I don't think you can have a functional society without it. In other words, I don't think you can be too extreme one way, as a libertarian is, and how the libertarian wants it to be, versus too extreme the other way, right? So I think there has to be maybe a middle, or even if it's skewed a little bit to the right, and we're going to have to talk more about these things. And this is the problem, Caleb, that I see in our society, is that we don't talk about these issues enough. We're not fleshing them out enough like me and you are right now, right? We're not doing this. We're not talking about this stuff, which could actually contribute to the overall good of the country. You know, we're not talking about these things anymore. We have a system in place, and then we just kind of let it go, you know? But anyways, that's just, and I'm all for the Convention of States. So
I think that's a good way to wrap it up now, I guess.
yeah,
Good
that's
place to
fine
end.
with me. But yeah.
All
Well,
right.
everyone, we Caleb, anything else you want to say? Okay, so guys, here's the thing. This is what's going on. Over the next 2 weeks, I'm gonna be gone. I'll be back on probably the 24th. That week is when I come back. So the week after that, the 26th, we'll have an interview with PRA Raw. We're going to critique a video and have an interview with one of my favorite TikTokers, Christ Defender. She's a UK apologist, she's really cool. So I'm excited about that. But I'm actually going on vacation. I haven't had one in a while, and
Where to?
I'm happy. We're going to Florida.
Whoa.
So we're
We're
going
in
to all the
Florida.
parks down there, and
Oh,
and
okay.
Tampa and Plant City. So my grandmother lives in Plant City, and my aunt lives in Tampa. So we'll be in that area, general area. So
You'll come back with the tan sunburn.
Caleb, yeah, right. Caleb and Travis will be taking over the show, and yeah, I'm excited to see what you guys put out.
Yeah, I think I don't. Well, I think I can broadcast this now, but I believe next Friday we're planning on having Ben Watkins from Relay Theology on, and we'll be discussing theology, atheism, and just philosophy of religion in general. So be sure to check that show out. I think Travis is setting it up, and I should be there, and it's going to be a lot of fun.
Right on. Well, everybody, again, sorry we missed Travis, but thanks for tuning in tonight. Have a happy 4th. Enjoy those fireworks.